Welcome to the Church Solutions Podcast, brought to you by JSL Solutions. The Church Solutions Podcast is designed to help equip you and your church in the use of technology and other tools and services. And now, here are your hosts, Steve Lacey and Phil Thompson.
Welcome to another edition of the Church Solutions Podcast.
Hi, my name's Steve Lacey.
And my name is Phil Thompson as I adjust the levels here. And our guest is going to be very upset with us here. But before we get to our guest today, we are a company called JSL Solutions. What do we do?
We provide streaming video, mobile apps, and church management stuff.
That's right. And we also have a podcast here that we do every week. Been doing this for quite some time, and we love to help churches. And so we not only talk about tech-related things, but we also talk about ministry-related things for churches, volunteers, and leadership stuff.
Yes.
So that's just who we are.
Yes. What are we talking about today?
We're going to talk today a little bit about audio, church sound, church audio. And that can be definitely a challenge, but we have an expert with us today.
And who is that?
His name is Trent Perkins. Trent, how are you?
I'm fine. It's good to be here today.
Well, thank you so much. So Trent is actually with a company called Wholehearted Productions, and your website is what, wholeheartedpro.com?
Yep, wholeheartedpro.com. That's
The
with a W.
The WH, right? Not the...
Yes. That's a very good point. Yeah, with the W, holistic. So I was afraid of this, but as soon as he walked in, he starts looking at our podcast setup, and I could see what's just inside his brain, all this stuff churning. Like, oh my goodness, these guys are pitiful.
Hey, but if it works,
well,
I'm all about making what you have work.
Yeah,
so if
and
it
we
works,
appreciate that.
Praise the Lord.
Well, and we do appreciate that, and we know that we had lunch together, and we know that you work with some high budget stuff as well as not so high budget for churches and ministries.
And where do we fit in that spectrum?
I don't know. It's a podcast. So let's talk. We just want to ask you some. And what I want to get to eventually is for those listening, volunteers, pastors, and things like, audio can be a challenge in churches. And so I want to get to some of that in a few minutes. But I think we want to ask a little bit about your history. Trent, how did you get involved in sound?
So when I was in college, I got involved with the chaplain's ministry, and I went to a Christian school. And so I had basically under my purview 2 little EV soundboards and 4 EV speakers and all the equipment to go do basically church. We'd have like groups of students that would go to various churches and do little mini concerts on Sunday mornings.
What college was that? Sorry to interrupt.
I went to Bethel University up in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Okay, all right. Minnesota.
And so that's kind of how I got started. And then in my sophomore year, my roommates, I hate the way they do sound around here. And I resemble that comment. And if you think you can do any better, how come you don't do anything about it? He says, because nobody's asked. I'm asking! And so he became a great mentor to me. And then as soon as I got done with college, I went on the road with a group called the Liberated Wailing Wall, which is part of Juice for Jesus. It was a Jewish gospel band, and I was the bus driver and sound guy. Yeah. And so every night I was in a different church. Sometimes they were, ginormous, big old soundboards, and sometimes they were not so big, and we'd use our system. Yeah. And sometimes the church sound system would be very broken, and I would get the opportunities to offer my input if the church was willing. A lot of times they'd have a better sound system when I got done. And that really became part of my passion as I went on. And like, man, I would love to do that for a living. And then I joined the Army. So 13 years later, the Army says, we're done. And I'm like, cool. So I started Wholehearted Productions. And I've been doing this full time for about 2 years now.
Wow, awesome.
So I was just thinking of these churches, like, wow, we had that band through, and we got a better sound system out of this deal, and we had to put on a great show. Yeah, bring them.
You were a blessing.
Let's get that band back. Make sure that sound guy comes.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that must have been a lot of fun, and that's kind of how you cut your teeth, I guess.
Yeah, and it was really I learned that not all churches are created equal. Yeah. Some churches have big budgets, some churches don't. But, ultimately, good sound is, 1, about not being a distraction to people, and 2, about proclaiming the Word of God. Yeah. if somebody comes to your church and the sound is horrible, they're never coming back, and they won't tell you why. They just like, that was dumb, and they may never darken your doors of another church. And so that's kind of become part of my passion of how can we make the experience at church as invisible and inviting as possible.
There's the sound guys. It's a thankless job, right? Because if they do an excellent job, nobody knows
they exist.
Yes, but if they do a terrible job, everyone knows.
Well, and we've said this even with, we do streaming video with streamingchurch.tv, and we've even said, guys, when we have churches and customers that work with us, what's really important is your audio. I've even made the statement that your audio is more important than your video. I've actually told people that because it's the same deal. I mean, if people are watching your video, but your audio is bad, they're not going to watch.
It's not very forgiving.
No.
Exactly. So audio is very important with streaming video, but as you said, it's important, as you walk into church with the sound and everything else. And I've been in churches where sound was a nightmare. And people don't come back, so good deal. All right.
And speaking of video, one of the ways to make the audio a lot better for your video, even if you don't have a separate board and somebody mixing, if you get your EQ for your house right, and some churches are like, what's an EQ? Exactly. There are devices that go somewhere between your soundboard and your amplifiers and speakers. Right. That basically make things sound right. And a lot of churches I've been in don't even have one.
Wow.
And if you don't have a device like that, that's basically taking into account all the acoustics of your room and the nature of your speakers, etc., then the audio that you're sending, you're basically EQing the room on every mic channel, and the audio you're sending to your video is going to be horrible. Mm-hmm. So that alone, fixing your house system will actually help your video system.
Yeah, if you run it out of that. So let's talk a little bit about some common things you see when you go in to help a church. Let's say a church calls you and says, we got to do something with our sound. We heard about you. Wholehearted Productions, Trent, can come in and look at our sound. What are some common issues that you come in and go, ooh?
So the biggest one really is an EQ. And a lot of churches either don't have one, or it's been completely bypassed because some kid came up there and screwed with the knobs, and so now it sounds worse than it did when it was in there.
Okay.
That's really almost a cornerstone of a system, and a lot of churches don't even have one in their system. So that's one.
And how do you go about? Let's just say, mine sounds terrible. How do you go about tuning the EQ? Does it take a trained ear to come in and say, okay, I know how to adjust this thing?
So a trained ear, definitely. I mean, honestly, I have the technology to do it by meters and, with cool whatevers. But a lot of it is an ear. You just that frequency isn't right. You find it and you kill it. Or it's just not there, and you add a little bit more of that frequency. A lot of it I actually do by ear. Just, I listen to music that I know, and if it sounds right in the room, it probably is right, and then I check with my cool high-speed machine, and it says, maybe a little bit more here, a little bit there, but a good ear can get pretty close.
So there's a machine out there that can say, this is where everything should be? Or
yeah, it's called an iPad.
Oh, yeah? So with some software on it? I mean,
yeah, so there's a variety of, they're called RTAs and or fast Fourier transform images. Depending on what you're trying to do and depending on how accurate you're trying to get, you can actually zoom in on a very small piece. And it's helpful when you're looking at bass audio because those frequencies are so long and so, how should I say, a 1/3 band graphic equalizer doesn't always get the job done. And so an RTA doesn't always show you exactly what's going on, but there's a variety of ways to look at the image of the sound that's coming into the device, whether that's coming into your computer via a microphone or into your iPad with good software.
I'm obviously a complete newbie on this, but that sounds like a good fix if I got sound at my place and I can install an app on my iPad and carry it into the sanctuary. And it will say, no, this frequency needs to come down. This one needs to come up. That would be
to some extent that is true, but the question is, where do you check it? Because it's going to be different in one spot from another. And it could be that it's not just the EQ that's bad. Maybe your speakers aren't aimed right. Maybe one speaker is louder than another, or depending on how your church is wired, maybe your highs and your lows from your speaker aren't necessarily in tune with each other. Your fill speakers aren't quite right. So there's a lot of things that ultimately go into this besides just the EQ. And depending on the size of your church, that's where it's also helpful to have
because
somebody
bodies,
that understands what's going on. And then
you get people in the building, in the room,
right?
That's going to affect everything.
Exactly, especially if you have a room with a hard floor, and you cover that up with a bunch of warm, fluffy bodies. That will change the sound a lot.
Yeah. So real quick here, back to the EQ thing. So when you said you tune it by ear, I mean, do you put a song on and run the song, or do you what do you listen to say, yeah, this thing needs adjusted or this needs to change? Is it just something that you personally have? Or I guess
it's interesting because I'm half deaf. Like literally, I wear hearing aids sometimes.
Huh?
Exactly. And so sometimes when I'm done, people will say, that sounds a little crispy. Okay, I'll fix that. I've become humble enough to say, okay, I do have my limitations. But it's one of those things where, experience, and if you really want to get good at EQing, and you should be good at EQing, even if you're not EQing your house, you still have to EQ each individual channel.
Right.
Sometimes just taking a graphic EQ and bringing up 2 or 3 bands all the way up and saying, oh, that's that sound. And then you bring them all the way down. Oh, well, it doesn't sound good if it's not there either.
Okay.
And you just do that all the way up, the 2 or 3 bands at a time, all the way up the graphic equalizer and back down, all the way up and all the way back down. You can kind of train your ear that way. And after you've played with it long enough, you'd be like, that's 500 hertz. That needs to be down a little bit, or I need a little bit more brightness, and that's like 3 or 4K. You kind of you develop that ear over time.
But you do it with one consistent product. I mean, one like a song or something.
I actually use a variety of songs, and part of that is because every song is mastered differently.
Right.
So you can't necessarily just rely on one song. Some people, they have their set list of that song sounds exactly like this. Every room's a little different, but you'll quickly figure out that certain things just don't sound right.
Right. Well, and then you have a choir or you have a band or something like that. So I'm asking for a friend here.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sitting here listening to this podcast, going, well, how can I fix this? Is what I'm. That's what I'm getting at.
And I have noticed now that you mentioned it, our sound guy will walk around the room. I'm like, what is this guy doing? How come he's not back on the soundboard? Yeah. And I'm like, oh, he's trying to see what it sounds like
everywhere else in
the room.
Which, depending on where your soundboard is, may be completely different than where your soundboard is.
Right.
Especially if it's like in an attic behind a window.
Yeah. Yeah.
I digress.
And it sounds like you've had that experience before, seeing that.
That's why they made iPads and digital soundboards.
All right. So EQ is a big issue for churches. What else is another issue? You mentioned something earlier about speaker placement. Do you find that a common problem?
Speaker placement, and sometimes they just wear out. If they've been there for 30 years, they just get tired. Yeah. And that's a good time to replace them. Also, the technology in speakers, especially with the concept of line arrays and other things like that, has improved so much over the last 10 or 20 years that you can actually get some significant improvements over what you used to have, which makes the sound throughout the room much more clear, much more consistent, much more like going to a real concert.
So I've got this, I don't know if you want to ask a question, but let me ask it first. So I know this church, and they have, it's like a square room, not very big, and they have, 2 speakers up front in the corners, one in one corner, one in the other, but they have it like pointed inward. Does that make sense? So they're kind of like the sound's coming out crisscrossing.
Yep.
I mean, and somebody said, yeah, that's a good way to do that. You're the expert. Is that a good way to do that or not?
I have some speakers that are pretty directional. They're 70 degrees wide. So if you take your arms and you basically make a right angle and then narrow that a little bit, it's about 70 degrees. I often will do that, and the reason for that is to keep the sound off the walls.
Okay.
And make sure I cover in front of the stage. So if that's all you have is 2 speakers, right, that's not a bad place. Now, the one hazard to that is if you have central. My pastor's in the middle, but I'm hearing the sound come from the side. Then, to some extent, it's nice to have a central speaker that kind of draws your attention.
Because it kind of confuses people. Like, wow, I'm looking right at this guy in front of me, but I'm hearing him talk over in my right ear.
My left, exactly.
Yeah. So my argument is, well, why don't you take those speakers and put them right at the front? That was my thought. Well, you should do that. I mean, but I guess, again, it depends on...
Every room is different.
Yeah, the room's different. The speakers could be different. There could be a logical reason why that was originally set up that way instead of having it right in front of people.
And I guess experiment if you have the option. And most people say, well, I can't move my speakers. It spent I spent a day and a half mounting them.
Yeah.
And I can't just carry them over here.
That can be
I will say this. If you have subwoofers, it's best to keep those centrally located and together. And that's because the really long wavelengths of those subs end up creating cancellation patterns that creates a checkerboard of low frequencies across your room.
So a subwoofer, for those of us who are novice, what is a subwoofer?
A subwoofer is usually a pretty big speaker, but it's dedicated just to low frequencies, below 100 hertz.
So like a bass, you'd hear bass coming out of that?
Exactly.
Okay.
A bass and your kick drums and that low, nice, warm, I'm here now sound.
Yeah, okay. Fills the room. And
exactly.
Yeah.
The low end that is nice, warm, satisfying. Yeah. If you can centralize that part of your frequency to the middle of the room, then you can often get a much more consistent coverage pattern throughout the room.
Okay, interesting.
So another probably common question you may get is, well, if I want good sound, I need good big budgets. Is that the case, or can I, if I'm operating on a budget, can I rival the sound of how much influence does dollar cost of equipment have over the quality of your sound, or is it a tuning thing?
Yes.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought.
For example, I was at a church today, and they're talking about spending some significant change on a nice professional sound system. And I was at that church with my system, my personal system, that costs way less than that they want to replace it with. And my system costs way less than their current soundboard does. Mine, speakers, snake, soundboard, everything costs way less than their current soundboard did. And yet people are just like, that sounded really good. Sometimes it's knowing how to use what you have.
Right.
So sometimes you don't necessarily have to spend a lot more money on equipment. It might be worth just investing some into making what you have do what it's supposed to do.
Right. So you could say, hey, I bring in someone like yourself, come and check out my system and have your way with all our knobs and controls, and they'll walk away with, wow, looks like we spent $50K on a new system. But
and sometimes even after you spend $50K on a new system, it's still helpful to have somebody come in and tune things.
Yeah.
I just did that at a recent church not too long ago, and they're like, "Ooh, got a lot of compliments about how much better things sounded." And it's not, churches are volunteer organizations, by and large, and even if you hire a sound guy, it's for an hour or two on Sunday. You're not hiring somebody to come and spend a week tuning your system, making things like tight. And even if you do have, it might not even take a week, might just take, an hour or so. But having somebody that really knows what they're doing can actually help the volunteers that come in and say, well, I can work with that. Mm-hmm. I can now, I have a good starting point.
So that's another question I was going to throw at you. What do you do? You just mentioned a lot of volunteers are involved, serving their churches. God bless them. That's awesome. But what do you do? I mean, how can you train a volunteer? What would you suggest? Because some of the problems may be the mix. So how do you go about somebody that's eager to help mix sound? How do you help them? How do you train them? And is it a couple hours? Do you point them to YouTube videos? Do they go to your website? I mean, how would you do that? How would you handle that?
I actually developed a sound training seminar, I call it. Okay. I used to try and do it all in the morning. It didn't happen. I start with, this is a sound wave. Vince Lombardi style. This is a sound wave. Yeah. Because I'm pretty convinced that if you understand the physics of what you're talking about, knowing how to deal with what is going on, whether or not you're actually the guy that's installing the system or, tuning it, whatever, all that should be done for you. But if something goes wrong, it's still a good idea to have my amps aren't on. Yeah, got it. I know I have amps, and there they are. And don't ask me how I know. But, so we start with this is a sound system. This is how your sound system's this is sound wave. This is how systems put together. And then every soundboard is created differently. If you have a short little analog board, it might not take more than 20 minutes to tell you everything on it. If you have a big digital board, even like an X32, which a lot of churches are getting, that's a bigger deal. There's, 30 years ago, that was $100,000 just of soundboard, not to mention another $100,000 worth of outboard gear. Right. And now you're handing it to churches for $2,000, which is pretty affordable, but it's still an awful lot of technology.
Is that a consistent trend with sound equipment? Are they
going down?
Is it going, is it following the line of, I don't know, computers or that sort of thing?
So there's some very, very capable soundboards within $2,000 to $6,000 that the average church can generally, wrap themselves around now.
Are the prices going down?
Yeah, are things going down? Do I just wait and
they're staying pretty consistent? Although I will say, I bought my X32 6 years ago when it was first out, and I paid a little less than $3,000, and happy I got a deal. And now it's $2,000. So that board has gotten less, and it really is kind of driving the entire market to try and how do I compete with the X32? Just because it's so much board for so little money.
And that's a model of who makes that?
Yeah, it's Behringer makes that. And then Midas made their M32, which has better preamps and it's fancier and it looks cooler. It was the same software.
What's the board? What do I got here?
Mackie.
I got a Mackie. Now, Mackie used to be a good brand, right? Or is it, you're rolling your eyes? Okay.
I've done a lot of sound on Mackies over the years. In terms of analog boards, they were kind of known for eventually losing channels just because of the way they were made.
Yeah.
But, right. I mean, a clean sounding board generally.
Yeah. All right, so we got off track. Sorry. So you got somebody. So you have a deal where you give people the basics. Now, here's a question: can anybody run sound, or do they actually have to have an ear for it?
Heart goes a long, long ways, but I will say this. At a certain point, sound is both art and science, and if you don't have the ear for it, it's going to be pretty challenging. And if you don't have a technological understanding, some ability to understand concepts of science, and, it's going to be a little challenging. But a heart goes a long, long ways. Can you train somebody with just heart to do sound? I've tried. And it doesn't usually last very long because even with a good heart, somebody's going to get frustrated because they just don't get it. And it's not a matter of, they're too dumb to figure it out. God just made all of us differently. And a sound guy is kind of a unique person. They're kind of a musician.
Are they?
They're a musician. The soundboard is the most important instrument in the band. And they're also a scientist.
Right.
Technology kind of guy. And it's a kind of a rare combination. It's amazing that we have as many of them as we do.
Yeah. Some of them may not really be qualified.
True.
I've been doing church stuff for a long time. I've bragged about it here for years, but I've had lots of frustrations. I used to lead music teams. I've had lots of frustrations with sound people. Sorry. The first part of my sound seminar, actually, before we get into the science of sound, is I go over Philippians 2:1-4, which basically says, think of everybody as better than yourselves. Be like Jesus. Don't be self-conceited. You put others before yourself. Think of others as better than yourself. And, the sound guy and the worship leader are in interesting positions because the worship leader wants to produce great music for everybody. And especially if you're using wedges, it becomes a big issue. The sound guy wants to make a great sound for everybody in the congregation. He doesn't want these wedges, the monitors blasting all over the stage. That's what I was going to ask you next.
And so the sound guy's like, but you can't have it that loud. And worship leader, but if I can't have it that loud, I can't hear what I'm doing, and then you have nothing to mix. So there has to be a certain amount of give and take, and that's why a lot of churches are now starting to go to in-ear monitors, which is basically wearing a pair of headphones. And now with digital boards having so many separate monitor mixes available, for $25 or $30 piece of equipment,
right.
You could actually have in-ear monitors at church. You don't have to spend $800 a set on a wireless system.
So what? I kind of watch that transformation in my church. I don't get in front of a bunch of different churches. I see them online, but I'm not in front of them. I was under the assumption that everybody went to in-ear. It was kind of like, now we're using smartphones now, so let's go to in-ears. Are there a bunch of churches that are doing monitors still, or?
There still are a lot of churches that use monitors, because a lot of them are in that transition point. They haven't yet gone there. They might not have the capabilities with their current sound system to go there until they replace their analog board with 4 outputs to a digital board that can actually answer the mail.
I used to enjoy watching those fights because the guy in guitar, I need more, and the sound guy says, no, you can't have more.
I hear it every Sunday where I'm at. I don't lead the music anymore, but I can oversee the whole deal, and I hear it every Sunday.
Yeah.
And some of that comes back to physics. If your guitar amp or your monitor is aimed at your ankle, you aren't going to hear it, but everybody else in the congregation will hear it just fine. Until you put ears on your calves, and get an amp stand.
Yeah, we're actually in the process of doing some transitioning to inner ears now. So, and we have a small room.
And the other thing about guitar amps is, ever heard of pods? They make guitar amp simulators that sound way more expensive than any amp you could ever afford, that don't produce any sound except through the system, and you're all happy. So that's also another consideration in terms of that stage noise.
Yeah. And so we only have about a minute left here, but I wanted to get to the monitor question. So, and again, there's probably no easy answer to that, other than maybe go with the inner ears.
Not inner ears, in-ears, right?
I will say it comes back down to EQ, though. If you can EQ your monitors a lot of times and get the angles right, a lot of times you can actually not screw up the house mix quite as much.
Okay.
You just have to actually EQ your monitor so that the person's actually hearing what they're trying to hear.
Yeah. That's a good tip. That's actually a very good tip. All right, good deal. All right. Anything else? You've got to run, so Steve has to run. Actually, I'm sure Trent is. All right, so how can people get a hold of you? Now, you're in Tucson, Arizona.
I am.
But for people, can people send you an email? You'd be willing to reach out.
They can send me an email at trent@wholeheartedpro.com.
All right, so Trent, Trent, wholeheartedpro.com. And it's whole, HWHOLE, heartedpro.com.
Yep.
So that's probably the best way. Your website is wholeheartedpro.com.
And even though my phone number sounds like it's from Tennessee, because that's where the Army first said you have to have a cell phone, my cell phone is 931-216-3157. But don't let the 931 area code scare you. I still live in Tucson.
Well, yeah, and we got people all over the world listening to this podcast. We're worldwide.
Awesome.
As far as we know. So people can call you or they could send you an email. And I know you're here in Arizona, but maybe you could help somebody somewhere else with some advice, or
you're a wholehearted what's the right word? You do all the services. You'll sell equipment, you'll tune systems, you do it all, right?
I actually even have my own sound and lighting system and can actually support your next small to medium sized concert.
Oh, okay. So
I'm actually preparing to do the National Day of Prayer in May down at the library in Tucson.
Oh, wow.
Super.
So you do it all.
So good to know. So Trent, we appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for coming over here. And we definitely need to have you on again, because we just kind of barely scratched the surface here. So we're out of time. So, folks, we'd love to get feedback. We gave you Trent's contact information, but you can always contact us. We'll relay the message to him. Just send us an email, support@streamingchurch.tv. So for Trent and the guy across the table from me, Steve Lacey, I'm Phil Thompson. Thanks for listening to the Church Solutions Podcast. Have yourself a great day.